Every now and again, there are events that happen in our nation, in our culture, that should cause people of faith to step back, to reflect, maybe to think, and maybe observe things from perspectives maybe that maybe we don't always recognize. And this is one of those times. As you know, there were two tragic shootings of black men by law enforcement, one in Louisiana, one in Minnesota. And then the next day, there was a rally held in Texas where 12 law enforcement officers were shot and 5 of them were killed. So if you were like me and you got up and you heard those stories, it was when I first heard Wednesday, when I heard the first of the first shootings, I saw the videos, I think like most of us did. I was angry, I was frustrated, I was grieved. There was just this whole run of emotions. But I had life to live. I think we all had to do life, didn't we? We all had to go to work and we had to do our thing. And mine was no different. I had the job of being a pastor here at a great church in Bettendorf, Iowa. So I kind of continued about my duties and then woke up Thursday morning hearing about these shootings of law enforcement officials in Texas. And it became really clear to me that I had to address this. I had to say something. There were people in our community that were angry and frustrated on every side of the issue. And what was what was interesting to me, instead of this being something that brought us together, grieving for the loss of life from people that got shot and law enforcement people that were shot, it divided us. So I got to a place that says, I have to speak to this. The problem with it is I didn't really know, I didn't have a clear path. And I had this really great message that was already prepared. It was already done. And I began really just thinking and praying and wrenching and reading and wrenching a little bit more and praying a little bit more and trying to find a path in all this. I couldn't find one. I didn't know what I would say. I didn't know how I would go about it until late Thursday. And then I began to think, I'm just going to approach this like I would any other kind of thorny academic issue. I live in the world of academia. And so I said, I'm going to approach it the same way I would anything. I'm going to research it. I'm going to conduct a study. Now, I had 2 days. I had Friday and I had Saturday. So I said, I'm just going to do the very best that I could. And I'm going to approach this from a qualitative and a quantitative perspective. So those of you that have lived in the field of academia, those are social science terms, which basically means I'm going to look at this from several different aspects. I'm going to try to look at the data, just the raw data. I want to get past the hyperbole, past all of the anger and the language that's designed to exacerbate the situation, and actually just try as well as I could to look at the raw data. What are the facts? What are the statistics? And then I thought, I'm going to also then look at it from a qualitative perspective. I'm going to interview people who are experts in this field. I'm going to talk to every law enforcement official I can get a hold of, every community organizer or pastor, people that work in education. And I thought, I've only got 2 days to do this. This is something that should probably, you should allot months and months and months of time, but I had 2 days. So I did that. I read everything I could. It's really hard to find data and statistics when it comes to police violence and death attributed to law enforcement. Because of the 17,000 precincts, the reporting is not always good. It's one of the things that we probably need to improve in. So it's difficult to find statistics, but I found some. And then I got on the phone. I just started calling people. I called law enforcement. I called people who are patrolmen, to people who are supervisors, people that work at a state and a federal level. I just conducted as many interviews as I could. I got on the phone to pastors that work, pastors and educators that work in these minority communities, people that are black and could speak to the black experience. I wish I could have conducted more interviews. I only had 2 days. And these people are passionate about their work. So every interview was an hour or more. So, and I had 10 of them over a span of about 2 days. And talked to 6 people in law enforcement, 4 people who are active in the community as pastors, educators, organizers. And I'm telling you, it was enlightening. These people that I spoke with are passionate. They're committed to their communities. They're committed to serving. They're committed to the rule of law and order, but they're also committed to the building up of our communities and seeking out the best path for people. It was encouraging to me. It has left me, if I'm honest, humbled, feeling woefully inadequate to have this talk with you. So if anybody could get up here and do it and do a better job with me than me, now would be a good time to raise your hand and come up and do it. I will take the little mic off and hand it to you. No? So I will do the best I can. Please indulge me. This will be difficult. There will be things that I will say that will offend some of you. You can't address thorny issues without some offense, can you? It fills me with sort of a unique perspective about our church. There are some pastors, even in our community, that can stand up with great boldness and just say what they think because their church all thinks like them on every side of any issue. Our church isn't that way. Our church is diverse. This is a very different community made up of people from very different places in life, places in education, places in experience, and I am really grateful for that. But it does make addressing difficult issues sometimes difficult, doesn't it? So I'm going to appeal to your grace. I'm going to appeal to your sense of community, your sense of feeling like Crosspoint has a unique place in our community. So indulge me, will you? Be gracious to me. Love me throughout it. You have to. The Bible says you have to. Let's pray together. Lord, I'm grateful for your Spirit. What can we do without your Spirit? We can't do anything. I'm so grateful for the empowerment you give when we ask. One of the great joys that you delight in, Lord, is when we say, come and fill us, Holy Spirit. You fill us, and I am filled. Lord, I pray that as we look at a complex issue in our culture, that you would give us wisdom, that you would give us grace, you would help us find a path forward so that we can truly be what your word says to be, that we can be light into our community. I'm grateful for each person here. And Lord, we're praying that you would give us wisdom, that you would give us grace, and that you would show us a clear path forward. And I pray these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. I think one of the biggest challenges of this whole issue is that we've created a bit of a false dichotomy, a dichotomy that says I either care about the lives of black people or I care about the lives of law enforcement. And the reality of it is I can and must care deeply about both, shouldn't I? As a person of faith, even just as a human, I need to care deeply about both of those things. I can't ignore the condition of some of our communities that live in the margins of society, that are undereducated, under-resourced, underemployed, where there's high crime rates and typically have large populations of minorities. At the same time, I have to be sensitive to law enforcement, don't I? These men and these women are constantly in difficult places in our communities, places that most of us would never want to be, and they're asked to do a difficult job. So we need to support them. We must, I insist on it, of supporting our law enforcement. So there's this kind of false dichotomy, and I want to suggest to you that we can do both things, and we must do both things. God cares about humans, all humans, whether they're black humans or they're law enforcement humans. Every human God cares about. But it shouldn't keep us from looking at the raw data. So let's do that. Let's look at the raw data. Now, as I said before, it's difficult to come up with stuff. So I've tried to find organizations that were succinct, that had good academics, that their sources were good. I've tried to cite all of my sources so that you can continue to study these issues. And so let's just take a look at some of this data. Deaths by police in 2015. Now, this is from a source called The Guardian. Some of the things that you find out is some of these sources, they compile data in different ways. You have to sort of look. I've done as much research as I could in 2 days looking into them. Some of these websites, they are more activist-oriented, so they have a very clear bias, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the data is incorrect. And so this is one of those sources, and their data seems to be accurate. It seems to line up with other things that I've read and researched. Deaths by police in 2015, 1,146 deaths, 581 were white, 306 were black, 195 Hispanic, 13 Native American, 24 Asian Pacific, 27 were unknown. Now, because I don't mean to diminish or disregard any race, I think any death is tragic and the loss of life should always be a concern for us. But for the sake of this discussion, we're primarily focusing on white and black deaths at the hands of police officers. Now, some would point to this and they would say, and by the way, I'm trying to paint a broad picture that will kind of take both perspectives into account. So please keep that in mind. Some would point to this and say, well, see, there's 580. There are more white deaths at the hands of law enforcement than there are black, and so we should make note of that. But I think it's also important to recognize that of those 50% deaths of white folk at the hands of law enforcement, white people make up 62% of the population, whereas of the 26 deaths, blacks only make 13% of the population. In other words, so the ratio is much greater. The likelihood of death at the hands of law enforcement to a black person is far greater than to a white person. So the ratio is denser, and so we're going to take a look at that here in a little bit more detail. In 2009. Kind of continuing at this. Now, there's a criminologist, let me bounce forward, named Heather McDonald, who wrote for the Wall Street Journal, and actually this particular data has found its way onto a number of different sites, so it kind of takes a little bit of more of a maybe conservative, I hate to use those labels, but maybe a conservative perspective. She notes that in 2009, blacks committed 62% of the robberies, 57% of the murders, 45% of the assaults in 75 of the largest counties, despite only comprising 50% of the population. So in other words, what she's asserting, and again, she's a criminologist, what she does, she says, look, in the 75 largest counties, there are these communities that, again, as I said, are these communities that sort of live in the margins. They're undereducated, they're underemployed, they're under-resourced, and there's high rates of crime. And within these communities, there's more minorities that live in these communities, so that when there's now law enforcement interacting in these communities, there's much more potential for violence to be in these communities between law enforcement and minority communities, particularly blacks. And so she writes regarding that. She says, such a concentration of criminal violence in minority communities means that officers will be disproportionately confronting armed and often resisting suspects in those communities, raising officers' own risks of using lethal force. Now, this is something that bore out as I talked with these law enforcement people that work in law enforcement. One fellow described, he says, when I patrol, I don't patrol areas that have low crime rates. That would be a waste of taxpayer dollars, wouldn't he? He says, I patrol areas that have high crime rates because that's where I'm needed. And then within these communities, you obviously you have greater population of minorities within these communities. There's higher crime. And so most of my interaction will be with a minority population, and then it's often, because of the high crime rates, it's often violent and confrontational, and so we have to understand that. So you can begin to see what the argument is, what the debate is the result of law enforcement and minority confrontation. Is that because police officers are biased and used processes that single out minorities, such as racial profiling, or is it because these communities are in the margins, and they have very specific needs to those communities. That's where the debate is coming. So this is one side of it. This is one side that basically says, hey, look, these are dangerous communities that have high levels of minority people in them, and so that when there's confrontation, the likelihood of it being with the minority is greatly elevated, according to what Heather McDonald is asserting. Now this is a website called mappingpoliceviolence.org. And if you research it, which I've tried to do as well as I could, this is clearly more of an activist website. But I wanted to include it so that we could all understand how people from all of the different perspectives are thinking. So you'll see in this website and some of this language that is sort of designed to inflame us. It's designed to be a little bit more punchy and a little bit more combative. So this is from mappingpoliceviolence.org, but their research seems to be good. So once you sort of get past some of the rhetoric, their numbers are good. The people that do the work seem to be, good researchers. They work in the social sciences. They seem to know what they're talking about. I did the best I could with some of these statistics, and they seem to measure up to what other organizations and other publishings tend to state. So black people most likely to be killed by police. Obviously, I've tried to retain that language, even though it sort of makes us wince a little bit, doesn't it? It's designed to sort of pit people against law enforcement. Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. 30% of black victims were unarmed in 2015 compared to 19% of white victims. In other words, if you're a person of color, you're more likely to have a confrontation that's deadly with the police than you are if you're white. When you drill into it, it actually gets a little bit deeper. From the Huffington Post, they do a good job of citing their sources, and they cite several studies of young black men aged 15 to 19 are 21 times more likely to be killed by police than white males aged 15 to 19. So young black men are 21 times more likely to have a deadly confrontation with law enforcement than their white counterparts. Now again, we're not assigning blame. We're just saying this is what exists. Why is that? Is that because law enforcement are racially profiling, or is that because these young men are growing up in these very socially marginalized communities? This is what the whole debate is about. But however you look at it, whichever side of it you're on, we all have to admit this is problematic, isn't it? This is something in our culture that needs to be addressed, so we're going to do the best that we can to address it. Going back to the mappingpoliceviolence.org, which again, be reminded, this is more of an activist website, but it doesn't mean that their data is not good. Fewer than 1/3 of black people were killed by police in America this year were suspected in a violent crime. So in other words, the 69% were nonviolent, were unarmed, 31% allegedly unarmed in violence. Now, what this does is this just looks at the statistics. It doesn't drill into the narrative. It doesn't explain what happened in these. And that's a part of this discussion that's missing from this particular site. Good social science says we look at the numbers, but we also have to factor in other things that might inform the study. So this doesn't do this. All this does is look at the broad strokes. It just takes kind of a mile-high view and say these are the numbers as they sort of flesh out. But it doesn't mean that there's not other things that will inform this particular data. And so that's all we're doing. We're just sort of looking at it. We don't know anything about those the nonviolent unarmed people. We don't know anything about those infractions. We don't know anything about the events that led up to them. All this does is sort of takes the broad look at it. Continuing in that same sort of line of thought, levels of crime in the United States and U.S. cities do not make it any more less likely for police to kill people. Again, I kind of apologize for that language, but I tried to keep it, I kept it exactly as the website has it. It's designed to be inflammatory. So I wanted to keep the specifics of it as much as I could. The levels of crime in the United States. So here's what they did. They took, and this is good data, they took a look at, I think it was maybe as much of 100, maybe 75 to 100, maybe more, of the largest metro areas in our nation, and they looked at the levels of crime, the levels of violence, and then compared it with the levels of fatal shootings of black people. And what they said is that there were communities that had very high levels of crime, but they didn't necessarily result in the deaths of black people in those communities from law enforcement. Now, it doesn't necessarily, so now this particular group is making some presuppositions. They say crime doesn't have anything to do with it because, again, they're making the argument that what's at fault here is the policing. So they say, look, crime doesn't have anything to do with it because here's these communities that have high levels of crime but have almost no fatal shootings. But again, that discounts a big part of the science because this is still in these heavily laden areas of crime. I would make the argument, as I've done the research that I could, that this speaks more of the policing in those communities. One of the things that came out in my interviews is that there are some areas of the country that do a much better job than other areas of the country. And by the way, I have to say this because as I did the interviews with the law enforcement people as well as the people that work in the community, I was extraordinarily proud of our law enforcement. They do an outstanding job. We don't have some of these issues that other metro areas have, and we're a fairly large metro area. So I'm very, very proud. I felt very encouraged to be able to come up and talk of this sort of difficult issue with the great sense of pride that our law enforcement officials do an outstanding job. So I would push back on this particular stat. So this group is saying, look, crime doesn't have anything to do with it because they want to make the argument that it's more about the police, the nature of policing, than it is about the crime. Because then if you say, no, that's about some of these communities, that creates a much bigger sociological issue, so they're trying to narrow the scope of it. I would make the argument, no, I would say this has a great deal to do with crime because these instances in whatever community are still in these communities that have levels of crime rate. It just means that some communities do a much better job than other communities do at interacting with minority populations. Here's an example. Newark, New Jersey, a population of nearly $300,000, 300,000 people, 52% black, a murder rate 400 per 100,000 people. No black people killed by the police since 2013. In contrast, St. Louis, Missouri, population over 300,000, 47% black, murder rate 38 per 100,000, 16 people killed by police. So there's this contrast of two municipalities, one that seems to do a much better job of interacting with minority populations than another. An interesting thing, and one of the officers that I spoke to actually served in St. Louis, and he said even within the greater St. Louis area, there were some precincts that did a much better job than other precincts. So again, these are broad strokes, and if we're going to really kind of understand it, it is helpful to sort of drill into the data as much as we can. But the point, what's emerging here from this data is that where you live matters. There are communities very similar in crime rate, very similar in population, all of these things, and yet some communities, some precincts do a much better job than other precincts. And again, it makes me grateful for our own law enforcement here in the Quad Cities. I think they do an outstanding job. And then this is an interesting thing. They say that there is no accountability. So this is within the mappingpoliceviolence.org, says that 97% of cases in 2015 did not result in any officers being charged with a crime. So in other words, of the 300 and some odd black deaths, there was just a handful of convictions. Now, what's interesting about this stat is that the officers that I spoke to spoke with great pride about this number. And they would go to extraordinary lengths explaining the review process, explaining all of the things that are put in place to have accountability and to be above reproach. One guy said, if I have an altercation, if there's something I said, I'll move the person to the front of the car where I'm in front of the camera so that everything can be documented. He says it keeps me accountable. I feel safer when I know that I have accountability. Another guy said, the one guy from Rock Island who's in a supervisory position, he said, we have done extraordinary work to research the best body cameras we can. He says, we're going to get the best ones we can get. They're expensive, but we're going to get the very best that we can get. Another guy said, body cameras should be paid for by the federal government. It's that important. There was not one guy or gal who was not completely open to scrutiny, completely open to accountability. One guy said, look, accountability is absolutely necessary to our work. If a cop is a rogue cop or a bad cop and he goes into a community and he does something that harms the trust between that community and law enforcement, it makes our jobs 1,000 times more difficult. He even said, I remember, I won't tell you what the video is because I don't want this to go to kind of get down into parsing out these 20-second YouTube videos, but he says, I saw this video of this cop doing this thing. He says, I was so angry about it. He says, if I could have disciplined that guy myself, I would have done it. Because in his mind, everything that was happening, he says, that's making it harder for his fellow law enforcement people to do their job. So in other words, for law enforcement, now they all talked about the internal review system, and they all said, look, nobody wants to be reviewed. Nobody wants to get into those sort of disciplinary actions, but we know that they're good for us. They're good for law enforcement. It's good for our job. As I reflected on it, sort of like me being a pastor, I have to have things in my life that hold me accountable. I have to have good board members. I have to have good spiritual leaders around me. I have to have people that hold me accountable. The worst thing that can happen to me is for people to lose trust in me, isn't it? If people lose trust in me, if they don't think I have virtue, and if I'm not honest, and if I'm not forthcoming, that would destroy my ministry career. The same is true in law enforcement. They say, look, if we don't have the trust of our community, then what do I have? I don't have anything. So to the person, they spoke proudly of it. They went to great detail to explain. The one fellow, he says, here's what happens. He says, look, there used to be a time that you'd have to get the name of the cop and his badge number, or her badge number. He said, but today, everything's GPS. You know where everything's at. You know if there's a traffic stop, you know what officer was involved. We're living our life, in full accountability. He says, it's just the way it is, and they welcome it. Every person did. The one gal who works at a federal level, who now is sort of a police of the policeman now, and she had some really terrific observations. But she says, look, nobody likes to do it. It's not something that people like to do. She says, I don't necessarily like to be the person that calls fellow officers into account, but it has to be done. And the officers all recognize it too. So I didn't find any. Now, some people might look at that statistic and say, but that's wrong. But the only thing I can respond to is I can say, look, from the interviews that I conducted, and I'm not a novice to social science. Most of my education is in social science. So I know how to conduct an interview. In the interviews that I did and the time that I spent, these men and women were very proud of the detail and the time that is invested in these internal affairs and these types of issues. They were proud of it. They spoke for it. They wanted it. Now, are there areas that need to be improved? Well, of course there are. Law enforcement is massive. There's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of officers, and there's 17,000 precincts throughout our nation, and the laws are complex. The communities are huge. Of course, there's always places to improve. And there's certainly metro areas that are corrupt and need a complete overhaul. But the men and the women that I spoke to, I can only speak to what I know, can't I? The men and women that I spoke to were very much affirming. They were proud of that number. They said, yes, the reason for that is because when they go through the internal process, when they have all of the investigations, when they look at all of the data, when they get beyond the 20-second YouTube clip. By the way, you can't know anything from a 20-second YouTube clip, can you? You can see something, you can make it angry, you can get angry, you can be hurt, but in the end, we don't know the details that led up to it. We don't know how combative the situation was. We just can't really tell. And we might get frustrated, we might get sorrowful, we might get angry, but in the end, we have to trust these processes. So I can't speak to every case. Nobody can. But what I can say is from the law enforcement people that I talk to, that I trust, these are good men and women committed to their communities, committed to their work, committed to the rule of law. They spoke very highly of these processes. They spoke with full confidence of them. They said they have to be there. And when a cop has done something wrong, when they acted inappropriately, if they took a life and they shouldn't have, that guy's career's over. As it should be. So, did all 6 of them lie to me? I don't think so. But again, I can't speak to every bit of it, but I can say from law enforcement's perspective, that's a number to be proud of. Others would say nobody's getting indicted here. It again just addresses the depths of and the complexity of this issue. Other things that I thought were interesting. There was a study from the Washington State University. I didn't cite it here, but it's interesting, so I'm going to just mention it. They conducted a study of kind of 3D imagery, sort of a simulation of scenarios for law enforcement. And in the 3D imaging and the video imaging, when law enforcement came against white suspects, Hispanic suspects, or black suspects, with the black suspects, they very definitely had a greater sense of danger. They would see weapons where there was none. They would approach that situation in a more state of readiness. Okay, so in other words, in the study, they showed that law enforcement very definitely saw black suspects as more dangerous than other suspects. But here's what's interesting. When they changed the imagery from digital imagery to live humans, and this is really interesting, when they actually put live suspects up there simulating the same interactions, and they used weapons that had laser lights, sort of like we would use laser tag, white officers were more reluctant to pull the trigger on black suspects than they were other suspects. They were significantly more reluctant, and in fact, they made much more mistakes because of that. And they concluded from the study it's because white officers are very, very much aware of the tensions between these minority communities and law enforcement, so it actually impedes their ability to police well. They actually are more reluctant to act, and it puts them in danger, and in some of these studies it showed that the results would have been deadly. Now, you can't conclude anything from these studies. One of the researchers said there is no data that supports, from these types of studies, there is no data that supports that a white officer is more likely to kill a black suspect. It just, the data does not exist. So that was from these sort of simulation and how a officer responds in sort of these high tense, violence-oriented confrontations. So I thought that was interesting. So the data just isn't there. So what they actually found in that particular study seems to actually be at odds with what some of these other organizations like mappingthepoliceviolence.org conclude. But again, I think it's something that we need to look at all of the data. So that's just a part of the data. I wanted to kind of give the broad strokes of it. Some of you may have, again, it's really hard to find. So some of you may have some better resource. I only had 2 days, and I had a ton of interviews, which took a lot of time. So I couldn't do nearly all of the research that I would have liked. So if you have resource that can be helpful, let me know. What you see emerging is, as I said earlier, this false dichotomy, this idea that one of the educators that I spoke to, and all of the community people were black people, because I wanted to get a sense of the black opinion. He said, well, here it kind of boils down to this: what do law enforcement think about black people, and what do black people think about law enforcement? And I think it's a pretty fair way of saying it. I would say that the heart of the issue comes down to is, can we attribute the amount of black deaths due to from law enforcement? Can we attribute that to poor policing, racial profiling, bias, programs and policies that single out minorities? Or do we attribute it to marginalized communities with high levels of poverty, high levels of unemployment, high levels of lack of education, and high violence and dense populations of minorities? That's really kind of where the lines get drawn. And I want to suggest to you there's probably some aspects of truth in both. Isn't it interesting that in most complicated issues in our culture, there is some reality to both sides, and I think we need to be fair and honest as we look at them. Let's talk a little bit about bias. Bias is tricky because A lot of times you hear people say, well, racial profiling has got to end. By the way, I'm totally against racial profiling in all its forms. I don't think there's ever a circumstance where we should racially profile people. I think people should be innocent until proven guilty. We should give them the benefit of the doubt. That's just where I'm at on it. The problem with racial profiling, we address it from law enforcement, is it doesn't exist in an institutional form. In other words, if I'm a first-year cop and I become a cop, I don't step into racial profiling 101. They don't teach me how to racially profile. And you say, well, okay, if you see a young black guy between the age of 14 and 19 and he's got a hoodie on and a backpack on, you're probably going to want to stop him because he's probably black and he's probably up to no good. Those types of dialogues don't happen. It doesn't exist at an institutional level. Now, in fact, what does exist is exactly the opposite. Law enforcement officers are regularly trained. In fact, one guy went to great depths to explain to me that the training to combat biases, to actually to expose the biases that we have. By the way, we all have biases. Every one of us have them. So law enforcement, more and more and more, are trained to recognize the biases that they may have and then how to respond appropriately in light of what may be biased behavior. Okay, do you follow me? So one guy says, we are getting the very best. These young guys are the very best. They're trained to understand their biases. They're trained to de-escalate situations. We're getting the best that we've ever had. And so, in fact, the opposite is true. Now, does that mean that biases exist? Of course they exist. They exist with all of us. I had a friend of mine years ago who was a correctional officer in some of the most difficult prison systems in California. And every day he had violent confrontations with black inmates. And every single day, and he came to me and says, Jim, I feel like I'm becoming racist. And I said, you have got to combat this at every level. You have a difficult job and you're stuck in a very difficult position, but you can't let that shape how you view other minority groups, particularly black people. Bias is not something that we set out to say we have. Nobody says, well, I think today I'm going to pick up a few biases. Nobody does it. It's more like poison oak. You sort of are walking around, you're doing your life, you wander through something, and all of a sudden you're sort of itchy and scratchy, and you're red and bumpy, and all of a sudden you've got poison oak, and you got to get rid of it. That's sort of what biases are like, except sometimes they're even more, they're even less known. Sometimes we have biases we don't even know about. But in other words, we pick up biases. Nobody just sets out to have one. You pick them out you pick them up through your culture, through your family of origin, through how you view society. And every human on planet Earth has to go to great lengths to scrutinize themselves, to understand the biases they have, and do whatever they can do to get rid of them. Law enforcement is no different. But it's very difficult for law enforcement that police these, that work in these minority communities, because they work with very specific segments of our society. So it's even a greater challenge for them. And by the way, every single person I talk to, including the people, the organizers and the people that worked in the black community, every single 100% recognize the problematic nature of biases. Every cop says, we've got them, we fight them, we work hard to recognize them, we work hard to make sure they're not a part of our policing. But I'm telling you, this is a challenge. But the people that I spoke to, I have great confidence that they do everything they can to be sure they're not policing from a biased perspective. Does that mean the bias doesn't exist within law enforcement? Of course it does, as it exists in every realm of human existence. This is why you get complaints of people saying, I got arrested for driving while black, things of that nature. And it's too bad. It's sad. It's things that in a perfect world, every law enforcement person ever on planet Earth would police completely unbiased. But that's in a perfect world with perfect humans in it. If we all had perfect humans, we wouldn't need law enforcement, would we? But we live in a fallen world. We live in a world that has crime, that has violence. We have men and women who are also fallen, trying to be sure that there's establishment of the rule of law. Their job is difficult. But what was encouraging to me is each law enforcement person recognized that biases exist, the challenge of them, how we have to be alert to them. The community organizers did as well. My good friend, Reverend P. Wonder Harris, has a wonderful program that helps address biases. And he talks about how deeply entrenched biases are in our culture. They exist, they're there. He's a wonderful black pastor in our community. You're gonna hear more from him in the future. And he's got this wonderful program that says, look, until we figure out biases, until we resolve them, there's things that we can do. Wonderful program. I'm going to tell you more about it in the future. So where we recognize that profiling at an institutional level doesn't exist the way maybe some of us think that it does, it doesn't mean that biases don't exist, and it also doesn't mean that there are some policing protocols that maybe have to change. Every single person I talk to says, policing is complex. One guy went to it was quite a history lesson talking about policies that were in place in the late 80s and early 90s that were proven to be ineffective. And they tried them for several years. They didn't work for a decade, and then they had to change them. So they're very open to saying, look, if there's policing things that single out minority populations or create hostility within these communities and neighborhoods, let's change them. There wasn't one person that was averse to that. So it doesn't mean that biases don't exist. It doesn't even mean that there are bad policies that might need to change. But what it means is that from my experience with the law enforcement that I spoke with, they're very open to accountability. They welcome it. They want it. They're very open to saying, hey, if things need to change, let's change it. But they're also saying, support us. Help us do our jobs. It was really encouraging to me. The same thing that the community people said. They said the very same thing. They said, we need to identify those things. We need to help them. We need to make their jobs easier. What was interesting to me is that every person, this was 100% of the people that I talked to, they all said, the problems, though, is as much as we might say, look, there's things that can change. I don't think there's anybody that would say, no, law enforcement is perfect, doesn't need to change. There's always things law enforcement is massive. There's always things and protocols that need to get better. But if we isolate all of it just to this, so this is kind of the heart of the argument. If we say, nope, it's only this, we still haven't addressed the issues that lead to high crime rates, that lead to poverty, that lead to cycles of poor behavior, don't we? So in other words, there may be some things that will change. There may be some communities that will look a little bit better statistically, but in the end, the problems of the culture and society haven't changed a bit, have they? And the problems that exist within these marginalized communities still exist. Every single person recognized that. Here's some common themes that developed. First of all of them said the media is just terrible on this because the media finds, sort of one aspect that tends to sell the most newspapers, get the most YouTube hits, go viral, and then it just blows the whole thing out of proportion. Everybody responds to it. It makes cops' jobs harder, and it makes community people's jobs harder. I'm going to talk about that a little more in a second. But they said we can't be so drug around by our noses with the media. We have to use wisdom. But they all said there's common themes that are developing in these communities. There's a lack of respect, not only just for authority, but for human life in general. These are 14 and 15-year-old boys and girls that are being killed. There's a disregard for it. And it should fill our hearts with sorrow. What happens in a community when they lose hope? We sang about hope today. These communities don't have hope. When you don't have hope, you don't care about human life. And we can get angry and we can stomp our fist and we can, shake our fist and stomp our feet. But in the end, we should be deeply moved with compassion. What's happened in these communities that they've lost hope? These are little boys and girls. There's a lack of, they're not taught authority. They don't understand how to respond to authority. One person said, one female pastor, she said, criminals raise criminals. Is that completely true? From her observation, she knows better than I do. So there's these repeating cycles of criminal behavior, repeating cycles of dependency on the federal government for welfare and for all the things that families need. They depend on the government. They work the system. They learn how to sleep with this person and live with that person and have these babies with that person. And there's this whole system. It's very... Sometimes you think, look, if you put as much energy into getting a job, you might actually move forward. Educate yourself. And I don't mean that in a trivial way. It's problematic. 100% of the people said that. They're saying this has got to be addressed. These cycles of behavior that are destroying these communities. So these are the issues. They said we need to be a part of them. Law enforcement wants to be a part of them. They want to be a part of the change. But that's the hard part. It's easy for me to march. It's easy for me to protest. The work of community change is difficult, and it takes years, if not decades. And that's the problem. Fundamentally, that's the problem. We're not investing ourselves. We're not stepping into these situations with a radical idea to change them. And that's what's needed. We have a great area of need, but we don't have people willing to put the time in. I think Jesus said something like that, didn't he? The field is ripe for harvest, but the workers are few. Part of what I wanted to do today is I wanted to get it out of the abstract and into some steps we can take. Clear steps that we can take. I don't have every solution, but I'm a little closer in my own heart and mind of some things that we can do. First thing that we can do is pray. I talked to one organizer, and he says, when I tell people, hey, the first thing we need to do is pray, he says, I've actually had people say, I'm done praying. It's time for action, which usually means it's time for violence. That's not the solution, folks. For anybody, no matter where you are on this debate, we have to pray. This requires profound wisdom. This requires profound grace, patience, compassion. You cannot do that without the Holy Spirit. You cannot do that without God guiding you. This requires prayer first. Without it, we're not going to do anything. So we pray. Second thing is we have to educate ourselves. I can't speak to every congregation, but I'm going to speak to this one. And I'm serious when I say it. We have got to stop educating ourselves through internet memes. Oh my God. If I see one more educated person who knows how to read a peer-reviewed study that bounces these idiotic memes and idiotic stories without citation, without any documentation, I'm going to lose it. It divides us. It makes law enforcement's jobs harder, and it makes our community people's jobs harder. Use wisdom, folks. We have to stop it. Most of the stuff we bounce around on Facebook is not true. It's just reflecting our own biases. That's all it does. So you might say, oh, this is, by the way, here's a little thing. If it's somebody that shot an impromptu video in their vehicle, probably shouldn't listen to that. If it's something that says, such and such happened until somebody destroyed that, that's just clickbait. Don't bounce that. If it doesn't cite a source, if it doesn't cite a peer-reviewed study, if it's not from a source that you can trust, don't bounce it. It's irresponsible. It's making us worse as a community on every side of it. Educate yourself. Read. Oh my God, I'm amazed at the lack of reading. Nobody reads. Read some things that actually are going to inform you. Learn what the problems are. These are deep sociological problems. You can't solve them with a 100-word article. Read. Educate yourself. Talk to people who see things differently than you see things. Talk to do what I did. Go talk to people in law enforcement. These are smart people. They're educated people. They're experts in their field. They're the best of the best. They can help you. Go talk to them. Go talk to some of these organizers. They're wonderful people. They want the same things we want, but they might look at it from a different perspective, and you might learn something. Learn, educate yourself. Get out of your echo chamber. You can't get all of your information from one or two sources. Don't get it all from Fox News. Don't get it all from MSNBC, and don't get any of it from The Blaze. Or The Onion, for God's sake. That's just a parody. If I see one more Christian person posting something from The Onion, I'm just going to slap you. It's not true. It's humor. Be smart. Get out of your echo chambers. It doesn't mean that there's not good information in Fox News. It doesn't mean there's not good information on MSNBC. It means you have to look at all of the angles. We are inundated with media. So we have to be smart. Otherwise, we're getting led around by our nostrils. It's ridiculous. Be smart. You people are smart. Some of you have extraordinary college educations, but then we do the very things that we were taught not to do in college. We just post stuff, even doesn't have any sources cited. All it does, it makes us feel good. And then people that think exactly like us go, yay, but it doesn't do anything to solve the problems of culture. Educate yourself. Read some stuff. If you don't know what to read, talk to me. I'll show you what to read. Talk to people that think differently than you. They're smart people. They want the same things from society as you want, but they just see things differently. But you'll learn things. We have to educate ourselves. 3, we have to get involved. We cannot just sit back and chuck hand grenades all the time. We have to get involved. The brother of Jesus, James, he says, faith without works is dead. I can have all the ideas I want, but if I don't involve myself, if I don't practice my faith in a way that's meaningful to my culture, my faith is dead. It means nothing. Get involved. Become part of a mentoring program. We have one of the directors for Big Brothers, Big Sisters right here in our church. We have wonderful community opportunities to serve, to lead, to be a part of change. Tutor some kids. Get to know some people. We're going to start doing some things right here in our own community. We have some wonderful opportunities. We're going to start partnering with some schools. We're going to start doing stuff. But when I come up here and I say, let's do some stuff with me. Let's make a change. We can do something. We can do something powerful. Get involved. Every single person, 100%, the cops and the community people, they said, get involved, go to some rallies, do a march. But it has to be more than that. It has to be deeper. It has to go beyond just this initial expression. It's hard work. I know it's hard work. It's kingdom work. It's necessary work. Get involved. You'll be glad that you did. The 4th thing is comply. It grieves me that I even have to include that on there, if I'm honest. But law enforcement's job is difficult. And things happen so quickly. And some of these problems have the potential for becoming very violent, very quick, or they already are. And if you're in those situations, if you find yourself in that situation, first of all, if you're an adult, just comply. It'll make it easier for everybody else. Be a part of the solution. But I cannot tell you how much it grieves me that I have to sort of single out our young black men. I cannot tell you how it grieves me, but I'm imploring you, just comply. I know it's hard. I know you can be angry, and I know you can feel marginalized, but I'm begging you to comply. And it's hard for me because I come from a long line of rebellious people. My people were moonshiners, and they were hillbillies, and they fought with law enforcement all the time. I have uncles that buried guns all over. Deeply inbred in me is rebellion. So I've had to confront that myself. So I want to do everything to understand, but I have probably had in the last 2 or 3 years, maybe a dozen conversations or more with black men who are business leaders, educators, pastors. And they all tell me of the time they have to have that conversation with their son, of how to behave when law enforcement pulls you over, how to behave when you find yourself in these situations. And it grieves me, if I'm being honest, it just makes me wrench because I've not had to have that conversation with my son. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry that this is the state of our nation, but I implore you, just comply. And here's why. What it'll do is it'll tamp down the whole situation. It'll make law enforcement's job a lot easier. They'll get to the truth of whatever that situation is. If you've done no wrong, you'll be released. Maybe there'll be a day when you don't have to. Maybe there'll be a day when there won't be crime, and there won't be bias, and there won't be complex racial situations, but today there are. So as your friend, and I can tell you, if you're a young person of any ethnicity, but particularly if you're a young black person, the law enforcement people in this congregation and this community love you. They really do. And it grieves me that we even have to have the discussion. But I want you to have confidence in your community. We are for you. We're not against you. And if you're an adult, please be part of the solution, not a part of the problem if you find yourself in one of those situations. Finally, show empathy. This is a complex sociological issue. Everybody acknowledges it. We can't reduce it down to a simple, video clip. If we could, then we could probably get through this thing a whole lot faster, but it's not that, is it? We don't know, in that 20-second video clip, we don't know what led up to it. We don't know what happened afterwards. We don't know what happened around it. We didn't conduct the interviews. We have to get past this and recognize this is a deeply complex sociological issue. It is. But at the same time, we can't disregard the thoughts and the feelings of our black brothers and sisters. We can't. I've had this conversation with men who are educated. They're people that are pillars in their community. They're husbands, they're fathers, they're pastors, they're teachers. They're good men. And we need to do all that we can to understand the black experience in America. It's a unique cultural phenomenon. There's a book that I have called The Soul of Black Folk. A guy turned me on to it about a year ago. It's phenomenal. Read it. If you have a Kindle, it's actually free. Read that. It will help you understand the heart and the soul of black culture in America. Read it. Again, it's part of the educate yourself. Do all that you can to enter in. These men and these women are not making this up. They're not just sort of being big crybabies and pulling it. These are deep emotional responses. These are not angry black men. A friend of mine named Kelvin Walker, I've known him for over 20 years. Him and I are in the same doctoral program in New York. He's a New York pastor, used to be a worship leader at a big church in Pittsburgh. Wonderful guy. I've known him forever. We both have a lot of shared experiences. We both were music pastors. I'm from, rural Northern California. He's from urban New York. Both kind of found our way into ministry and did music ministry for years and years. And now he's a senior pastor, and he's also getting his doctoral work done. And so it's been really fun to kind of reconnect with him. Really a wonderful guy. Smart guy. Spirit-filled guy. A guy that I gladly say, come and preach in my church anytime. Here's what he wrote. A black man's lament. License and registration. And within seconds, he's dead. I'm sorry, y'all. Please forgive me. But this is messing with my head. 2 men in 2 days. This can't possibly be real. Now we're at 115 this year or more. I've lost count. I think I've just kept quiet out of fear. I don't even know how I feel. Would I be treated like Williams and Lecrae, but as one who serves the God of love and justice? There's just no way. I can't continue in quiet while I'm weeping in silence and not be a prophetic voice for change, because if I do not say something or stand for something or do something, then Alton and Philando have both died in vain. It's time to admit it. It's time to own it and deal with it. More black men will be lost without us addressing it. I can't wake up another day like this, and before you think I'm over-dramatizing things, I have been stopped for no reason on many occasions. And when I go into the store, I'm always aware of all the eyes that are on me for more than just a stare. This is not made up. This is for real. And as long as we're silent, then nothing will heal or change or shift. And more lives will be lost. And I, for one, am tired of living in fear. So please hear. I'm not asking you to get it. I just want you to understand. This isn't the rant of an angry black man. It's a black man's lament. The shame of it is I wake up with it every day. It just won't go away. What will I do? What mistake will I make? What turn will I turn that puts my life at stake? I try to think differently. Believe me, it's no fun. But with every news report, I think, will I be the next one, or my grandsons, if nothing is done? Because I'm 50 years old. Or my sons. To date, nothing has changed. So why should I have hope for my grandsons? Dear God, they can't stay the same. So I ask you, don't debate me. Join my lament instead. And maybe, just maybe, you'll get inside my head and see what I see and live what I live and feel what I feel and understand why I give, or I'm giving my voice to say, no more. This has to stop. And then don't just lament with me. Join me in saying, no more. Now, wherever you are on all of this, if you feel that the problem is policing, or you feel that the problem is communities, or if you feel, as I do, there's a lot of room to improve in somewhere here in the middle, every time life is lost is tragic. It does no good to kind of go back and say, well, yeah, but see, this person was this and this, and he did that and that. And sometimes that helps to inform the situation, but in the end, it doesn't really help, does it? We need to deeply grieve the loss of human life, and we need to deeply grieve the conditions in our culture that create situations where black people are disproportionately killed than white people. Whatever the circumstances, or wherever you are on it. And this is the appeal that my friend Kelvin is making. This is the appeal that I'm making. I believe that Crosspoint Church is a unique church. I really do. I believe that we can be a strong voice in this community. I could not be more proud of our law enforcement. I couldn't be more proud of them. They are wonderful people that are doing the hard work, establishing the rule of law, keeping our community safe, and doing all that they can to understand the complexity of culture. It's difficult. Let's make their job easier. And at the same time, let's hear the voice of a group of our culture that's not being heard. If somebody says Black Lives Matter, and then we say, well, all lives matter. Well, of course it's true, all lives matter, don't they? And whereas our intentions might be good, we're disregarding, we're not hearing a problem. It's sort of like in the 19th century when we're trying to solve the problems of slavery, and people were saying black men and women need to be free. And what if somebody said, well, all people need to be free? It takes a very specific problem and it sort of puts it in the abstract. Do all lives matter? Of course all lives matter. But this is a group of our community saying, will you hear us? Hear our problems. Understand me. And I think as a community of faith, we can do that. I believe we can understand the voice of Black America. And I think we can do that and be deeply concerned about the cultural issues that exist there, at the same time support our law enforcement and make their jobs easier. I know it's difficult. I know it's the harder path, but I believe it's the right path. If I offended you, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. But let's find a way to move forward. Agreed? I think we can do this. God bless you. Enjoy the rest of your day.